Coming up on KCCI 8 News Close Up, deciphering the debate, what undecided voters in Iowa thought of the 7 Republican candidates battling for breakthrough. And another no-show for the Republican frontrunner, what Donald Trump was doing in Michigan while his opponents squared off. And a new poll looks at Iowa with less than 4 months before the caucuses. The results on how many Iowans have settled on their candidate.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Good morning and thank you for joining us. I'm KCCI Chief Political Reporter Amanda Rooker. Well, 7 Republican presidential candidates had a second national showdown Wednesday night at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. Those on the debate stage include Doug Burgum, Chris Christie, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, and Vivek Ramaswamy and Tim Scott. Asa Hutchinson, who qualified for the first debate, did not qualify for the second. Donald Trump did meet requirements but chose not to participate. Some local Republicans watched Wednesday night's showdown at an Ankeny watch party. We spoke with potential caucus goers on whether that debate changed their minds. Over 100 Iowa voters packed into an Ankeny restaurant Wednesday night to watch 7 presidential candidates face off. Many Iowans undecided and looking to the debate stage for help in making a decision.
I don't really know who's the right kind of candidate for me because it's very much like I'm still undecided. I'm very much right down the middle for stuff.
Vinny Cataldo still is not locked in to any one candidate, but he came away with a strong impression of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
I think Ron DeSantis was kind of my first choice simply because, he was kind of the one that made it out to be he was very much America first and he wanted it for the people, and he kind of made it I saw with him a lot of, he went after Biden, he went after Trump. He made it clear that neither of them were the right candidate, and he made it clear also that he was the one that wanted America first, basically. And he wanted to put taxes, he wanted to lower taxes.
For Iowa voter Michael Brixius, exchanges between former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley and businessman Vivek Ramaswamy tipped the scale.
I think that Ramaswamy had kind of a rough night. In my opinion, I think Nikki Haley did the best job of balancing actual issues along with being a good debater in that she's attacking and also not afraid to take questions and take heat back.
Brixius was also critical of Republican frontrunner and former President Donald Trump's decision to skip Wednesday night's debate.
There's the general rule. If you don't show up for a debate, you typically lose. He's not doing himself any favors by not showing up. I think he's trying to rely on the fact that he's already got a popular base and leading on that, and that doesn't look good on my end.
A change-up from the first Republican debate in Milwaukee, Brixius felt candidates Wednesday night had more authentic moments.
Well, when the debaters started to actually get to going at each other rather than just going beyond their pre-thought of lines. I liked it when they're kind of ad-libbing and talking what they really think rather than what their rehearsed lines were.
But others say the second Republican debate was also marked by more attacks between candidates, shouting, and constant interruptions.
I think that it's become a lot more divisive than it was from the last debate.
Iowa Republican Jen McDonald says candidates did cover a wide range of topics.
They hit on everything that's important. They hit on healthcare, they hit on education, they hit on national border security. But for me, what was left out and has consistently been left out is supporting veterans, potentially reforming the VA, supporting continuing to build back up the military, because we're talking security. Nikki Haley spoke about sending special forces as a response, but where are we getting these troops?
McDonald came into the debate undecided, looking for clarity on who to caucus for. She left without it.
Definitely, it didn't help me at all.
State Senator Mike Buslow also left without a first-choice candidate, but he says he was encouraged by the crowds watching.
The excitement here is what really stood out to me. It's a weeknight during the school year, late at night, and we've got a ton of people here. All of these debates help, right? It's winnowing the field, and we need to keep hearing from them. I'm looking forward to hearing from them more in person as we get down to crunch time here in Iowa.
Coming up on Close Up, we sit down with younger Republicans to hear about what they saw in the second Republican debate and whether it helped them decide who to support. And Donald Trump again chose not to debate, what he did instead to try to sway Michigan voters. Well, 3 young Iowa Republicans from all across the state came here to KCCI to watch Wednesday night's debate at the studio of KCCI. We have them with us today. Thomas, Kendall, Haley, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
And the two of you came into the debate undecided. Thomas, you had someone that you were kind of leaning towards. Did Wednesday night's debate change your mind for who you plan to support in the Iowa caucuses?
Not specifically, but it allowed the cream to rise to the top. I think here in Iowa, our job is to vet the candidates. Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis really had great nights. They were towards the center of the stage. They drew a lot of attention. They both drew upon their records, both as UN ambassador and as the governor of Florida. And so I think those two really rose to the top. And I think I'm between those two candidates right now.
Thomas, I saw you nodding your head. Were those the two candidates that stood out to you, or was there someone different?
No, DeSantis definitely did a very good job. I think he did a lot better than the first one. I think he kind of made some corrections to the first debate and really did a great job of, as Kendall said, kind of talking about what he's done in the past and speaking to his record and really just highlighting what he's done in Florida to turn that state into a very strong bastion of freedom. And, you know, it's really good Republican state down there now, and I think that's something that he showcased that he can do at the national level as well. And you know, Nikki Haley did a good job.
Were there any kind of standout moments from DeSantis that you were hoping to see that you saw tonight, Thomas, that made you excited about DeSantis?
Yeah, I think when he went after Trump a little bit, he talked about how Trump wasn't at the debate and how they really needed to hear from him. And you know, when you don't have Donald Trump coming to these debates and defending his actions as president and defending his record and his policy decisions, and while the other candidates are out there, I think it says something, and you know, DeSantis doing that was important, I believe.
And I want to talk a little bit about Trump not being at the debate and how that impacted Wednesday night's debate. But first, Haley, I want to check in with you.
I still remain undecided as to who I would go for in caucus night, but I do think that Nikki Haley did a really great job. She remained very civil. I do think she received a lot of attacks throughout the entire debate, and she stuck to her background, her record as governor and as UN ambassador. DeSantis, really the same thing there. I thought he stood out to me a lot more tonight than he did during the first debate. And I was actually really shocked with how Chris Christie performed. I thought he was pretty punchy, and he got to the point, and I did like that he called out Trump for not being present on stage and giving Republicans a debate that they deserve.
Were there any candidates that maybe didn't meet your expectations?
Yeah, I think you know, Governor Burgum and former Vice President Mike Pence were on the edge of the debate stage for a reason. I think we're seeing in fundraising numbers and in the polling, they're kind of slowing down a little bit. I think if any of them, they might be the first two that are kind of dropping off a little bit. I don't think they have some good points, but I just don't think they really lived up to what they could be, and you know, I just don't think their policies are really up there with DeSantis and Haley and Vivek and the rest of them.
Haley, was there anyone that you were looking to hear more from and maybe fell flat on Wednesday night? You didn't see them perform as strongly as you would have hoped?
Yeah, so aside from the candidates that Thomas mentioned, I would say Tim Scott was one I was not super impressed with just during the debate. He wasn't as articulate as he normally is, and I just think he struggled to really differentiate why he would make the best candidate, either as an alternative to Trump and also someone that can help beat Biden.
Kendall, what about you?
Yeah, I think, like Thomas said, you have a couple candidates at the edge of the stage that are just falling off the stage. And I think you're going to see this field start to narrow. And I hope that over the next month, as some of these candidates start to dwindle, they honestly start to drop out. Because I would like to see those center stage candidates at the next debate to get really down into the issues that I really care about. Because right now, with that many people on the stage, when you have 7 people on the stage, they're fighting back and forth, right? And so I want to really get into those issues that I care about and the issues that Iowans care about. And I'm really hoping that we see some more of that in the next debate. And even Chris Christie, he's not campaigning in Iowa. So for me, that kind of makes me look at him a little bit differently. And so I'm really looking at those candidates that are at the middle of the stage.
Overall, for the three of you, was there any topic that you were really looking for these candidates to address that didn't come up, or you wish more time would have been spent on it during Wednesday night's debate?
I think one big issue that I thought was going to be brought up that didn't really come up was the abortion issue. I know Chris Christie got one question about it, but the answer ended up kind of going a different route. But after Donald Trump's comments on Meet the Press, I think that's something that a lot of Republican voters are looking at right now, especially in Iowa.
Haley, I was surprised that they didn't ask more about abortion, just considering the interview that President Trump did with Meet the Press. I know that was a big thing in my Twitter feed, all over Facebook, that a lot of Republicans were upset about. And in Iowa, in particular, we do have a lot of voters where this is a single issue that they will go to the polls for. And so to kind of glaze over a really important topic like abortion and not go in depth as much as I thought that they would was just surprising to me.
In that interview, that Meet the Press interview, Donald Trump was asked about Ron DeSantis's Florida, the Florida law on abortion that Ron DeSantis signed that would ban abortion around 6 weeks, where Donald Trump called it a terrible thing and a terrible mistake. I want to talk a little bit about Donald Trump and the role that he played or didn't play on Wednesday night's debate stage. But were you surprised at all that the candidates didn't mention Trump's comments on abortion bans on that debate stage, or was that something that didn't need to be mentioned?
I think it's something that should be brought up. I think that a president that prides himself on being a pro-life conservative would say something like that's a little confusing to hear, especially when we've seen such big victories with the 6-week rulings in Iowa, Florida, and some other places.
How do you feel like the candidates handled talking about Trump? Did you feel like they handled it well, or do you wish they would have talked about him in a different way?
I thought they did turn to substance a lot, and they talked about each other more. And I thought that was really important because Donald Trump was not in the room. Right, wrong, or otherwise, he wasn't in the room. And so I really appreciated the fact that they stuck to substance, they stuck to the things that Americans really care about, and they're not there to just hear about Donald Trump. They're there to hear about the issues.
Haley, anything that you felt that stood out to you and how they addressed Trump?
Yeah, I was really shocked to see Governor Chris Christie speak directly to the camera. Definitely was thrown off by that. I think if they didn't mention him, it would seem like they're obviously ignoring an elephant in the room. If they mentioned him too much, then it kind of takes away from their own platform. So I think there was a healthy amount of mentions of Trump. It was almost like he was on the stage just by sheer number of Trump mentions, but I think that you walk a fine line if you don't mention both, issues that you have with his presidency or his stances, and why you're different from him, and how you can win the presidency.
All three of you would fit into the younger Republican category. That did come up on the debate stage. Vivek Ramaswamy said that he is the only candidate that is engaging younger voters in the party. What did you make of him making that claim? Do you feel like Vivek Ramaswamy understands you as, the younger generation? What did you think of his comments on that?
I think he's someone that is able to, capture young folks in a way that a lot of these other candidates don't, because a lot of them appeal to a lot of the older crowd, because that's predominantly those that make the decisions when it comes to voting. But a lot of my younger friends, they're paying attention to Vivek, and that's something where they haven't in the past. Everything's about Trump, obviously, but he's definitely someone that a lot of people that aren't super politically active have reached out and they're saying, hey, this guy's pretty entertaining, and to see someone that's 38 years old is definitely a fresh thing to see, especially when President right now is in his 70s, and President Trump, former President Trump, is also in his 70s. So it's a good change of pace.
Is there anything that you think that this debate did that could change momentum for any of the candidates in Iowa?
Well, Amanda, I think that Iowa is first for a reason. We're looking at the candidates, we're just picking out the ones that we see are authentic, that are true leaders that can help guide the party moving forward. So I think that's the really important thing. But yes, we haven't seen very many shifts in the poll numbers yet because I think people aren't quite sure. People are waiting for these candidates to show up in their local communities and engage with them. And I think as you see that happen, you'll start to see things happen from the first debate, the second debate, and as we look forward to the third debate. I think people will start making those decisions, whereas right now, I feel like people are starting to funnel the candidates into categories, first choice, second choice, third choice. And I think that's where people are going. So I think as we get closer to Thanksgiving and Christmas, and when people sit around their tables and talk about the candidates, you're really going to start to see shifts throughout the polls, not just in Iowa, but throughout the country.
Anything else to add, Thomas, Haley?
I think it might help people make their decision leading into January, but hopefully, in the coming months in the next debate, it's really going to matter for Republicans who are undecided like myself.
Well, all three of you, thank you so much for coming to KCCI, watching the debate here, and sharing your thoughts and perspectives. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Still to come on Close Up, Donald Trump again skipped the Republican debate. Why the GOP frontrunner campaigned in Michigan instead. And how sold are likely Iowa caucus goers on Donald Trump? The results of a new poll next on Close Up. Do you want me, do I stay on that couch and then move to the PS1 during the VO? Oh, so Kayla's gonna be on set too.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Love the jumpsuit, by the way.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Welcome back to Close Up. Donald Trump skipped both the first and second Republican debate. Back in August, Trump posted on his social media app Truth Social that, quote, the public already knows about him and his presidency. Trump also responded to Fox News host Bret Baier during an interview asking, quote, why should he agree to debate people who aren't rating high in the polls? Instead of going to California to debate, Trump instead traveled to Michigan on Wednesday, touring a manufacturing plant there before addressing a few hundred people. Trump claimed the transition to electric vehicles would mean fewer automotive manufacturing jobs in Michigan and asked union workers to tell their leadership to endorse him for president.
So tell your UAW leadership, no problems with them, but they have to endorse Trump, because if they don't, all they're doing is committing suicide. And honestly, you don't want that to happen, because they're committing suicide on the back of your jobs, and you can't let that happen.
The United Auto Workers Union backed President Biden in 2020. Biden himself made the first presidential visit to a picket line last week when he spoke to striking workers. Well, KCCI's Kayla James joins us now with more on Trump's visit to Michigan. And Kayla, you covered that campaign event. Tell me a little bit more. What was Trump's strategy in skipping the Republican debate?
Well, Amanda, Trump spoke for more than an hour. Like you mentioned, the majority of the speech was focused around the UAW strike, but the Republican frontrunner did mention the debate once. He referred to those on the stage as, quote, job candidates, saying they're, quote, all applying for a job. But minus that moment, Trump really didn't focus on the debate. Instead, he focused on appealing to those in the audience, presumably auto workers. Trump told them early on he was there to lay out a vision for a revival of economic nationalism. He then spent a lot of time mentioning President Biden. At one point, Trump telling the crowd in a few years the auto industry will be out of business unless he returns to the Oval Office. Towards the end of the night, Trump mentioned the UAW's president, Shawn Fain. Now, Fain spoke publicly in the days before Trump's visit, saying he sees, quote, no point in meeting with Trump because he serves the, quote, billionaire class. Wednesday night, Trump called for Fain to endorse him. He ended the night by saying if elected, he would put America and the workers first.
Well, Kayla, thank you. Still to come on Close Up, Trump remains the Republican frontrunner here in Iowa, but how strong is his support? What a new poll of likely caucus goers found, that's coming up.
Time period in the history.
Well, welcome back to Close Up. There's less than 4 months until the Iowa caucuses. And as you heard earlier on Close Up, and anecdotally, we're hearing from many Iowa Republicans that they don't know yet which candidate they plan to caucus for. Well, CBS News and YouGov, a market research company, recently polled likely Iowa caucus goers about the presidential race. They asked them what they think about when choosing a candidate. They talked to Iowans from September 15th through the 24th, and the poll has a margin of error of 6.1%. One of the first things that likely caucus goers were asked was if the Iowa caucuses were held today, who would you support? The poll found that 51% of respondents said they would support Donald Trump. That's more than a 2-to-1 margin over his closest competitor, Ron DeSantis. DeSantis is the only other candidate in that poll showing double-digit support at 20%. When asked which candidates they felt could beat Joe Biden in the general election, 58% said Trump could, compared to 43% who say DeSantis would. When likely caucus goers were asked about whether they're sold on Trump or whether they're still considering other candidates, 20% of respondents say they're only looking at former President Donald Trump. 47% of respondents say they're considering Trump and other candidates. That leaves 31% saying they are not considering Donald Trump at all. So, how important are debates when we're evaluating all of these candidates? 62% of likely Iowa caucus goers say they use debates to help make their decision on which candidate they'll support. But nearly as many say they're also swayed by face-to-face campaign meetings. Less than half say they base their decision on a candidate's appearance on various media sources. Political endorsements also don't seem to matter much to Iowa caucus goers. 44% of those surveyed said they don't take them into consideration. Only 16% says endorsement would matter if Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds endorsed a candidate herself, about the same number that take the endorsement of friends, family, and other Iowa politicians. Earlier on Close Up, you heard from young Republicans about how important the topic of abortion is to their party and how they still are wondering how many candidates feel on abortion. Well, the poll found 77% of likely Iowa caucus voters think abortion should be illegal in most, if not all, cases. When asked who should be punished in the case of an illegal abortion, 76% said the doctor and medical staff. 58% said the woman who had the procedure should face some kind of criminal punishment. Well, thank you for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. We'll see you back here next Sunday. Have a great day.